At the Last Supper, as we read in the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus took bread. Giving thanks, he said the blessing, broke the bread, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat it, for this is my body." And in a like manner the chalice, "Take this and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood." We hear these words at the consecration at each and every Mass. They are an ordinance passed on for over 2,000 years. They provide the form, in other words, the words to be used at the consecration, and the matter, the elements to be used, bread and wine. St. John omits these words in his discussion of the Last Supper. Instead, he develops the doctrine in his Bread of Life discourse, chapter 6 in John's Gospel, which began actually last week with the feeding of the 5,000 and continues today and in the coming weeks. And it's that basic doctrine that so many Catholics are trying to explain the concept of the real presence, that belief that we have, because our focus always is on the gospel at the Last Supper. St. John's Gospel gives us that doctrine. The disciples and the early church fathers certainly recognized in the words, he took bread, gave thanks, broke the bread, and gave it. These words at the Last Supper were identical to those presented in the Bread of Life discourse. And they understood the doctrine of the Eucharist that John was presenting. In last week's Gospel, we hear that Jesus, after feeding the 5,000, directs that the fragments left over should be gathered up so that nothing was wasted. And the church fathers saw this, the leftover as the leftover sacred host after communion, to be reserved in the tabernacle, taken to the sick, the homebound, reserved in the church for adoration. The real presence of Christ, always available to his faithful. In our gospel this week, we continue from the gospel that left off with the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish. This miracle is followed by Jesus staying behind in prayer while his disciples took a boat to Capernaum across the sea. One line that's omitted in both readings this week and last week is he later joined them by walking on the water. And so our gospel begins today with the crowds who took their own boats back to Capernaum, surprised to see Jesus was already there. They knew that he had stayed behind while his disciples left, and they knew that he hadn't taken a boat with them, so they were puzzled as to how Jesus got there so quickly. I guess Jesus could have said, well, I just walked across the water, which who knows what response that would have gotten. But all they know is Jesus got there, and how did this happen? But this is part of John's irony. They know that Jesus somehow pulled off the impossible, but the crowds don't understand what they've been seeing in Jesus all this time. They witness the multiplication of the loaves, but they don't see what's really happening here. God is among them. Continuing last week's dialogue, Jesus challenges the crowds that they're only following him to fill their bellies. They're impressed by his capacity to supply for their needs, but don't understand what he's trying to say to them through the multiplication. They want him for what he can do for them, not for who he truly is. And Jesus will tell them, very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of loaves. But in that miracle, Jesus was only using bread as a symbol of something greater. He was using the physical to point toward the spiritual. That's why he now tells them to look beyond the bread. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which is the Son of Man will give you. He's building them up for those of you who were at the funeral today. As we get further along in John's gospel, is he actually will tell them this is my real flesh that you will eat. It will give you eternal life. Bodily food keeps our bodies alive, but does little for our soul. And Jesus came to save our souls. And all the healing miracles of the Bible, in some way or another, point to this. In the multiplication of loaves, Jesus is pointing us to the fact that he is the one who will give us spiritual food, the food that will heal and strengthen our souls and sustain us on our journey to heaven. This part of the discourse is similar to the conversation Jesus has in chapter 4 of John's Gospel with the Samaritan woman by the well. On that occasion, Jesus was speaking about water springing up to eternal life. Here he speaks of bread coming down from heaven to give life to the world. And there the Samaritan woman was asking Jesus, "Gee, are you greater than Jacob who gave us this well?" And likewise today we hear the people want to know, "Gee, can you comparing yourself to Moses?" In other words, Moses gave us manna, daily bread from heaven. They said, "What can you do?" Whether they forgot the miracle that just happened or were challenging Jesus to reveal more power, I can't say. But again, it's obvious that they just don't recognize who Jesus is. They have seen or heard of many miracles Jesus has performed. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the dead are raised to life, and yet they demand another sign. But you see, miracles don't produce faith. They can strengthen faith, even awaken a weak faith, but they can't produce faith where it doesn't exist. And that's because miracles will never satisfy those who have no faith. They will always find ways to explain them away, or always ask for one more sign, more power to be shown. Miracles can never satisfy those who have no faith. And isn't faith just what he asked of them? They asked him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" And his response is, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." Notice how Jesus switches from the plural to the singular. The people ask, "What must we do?" And Jesus replies, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him," individuals. And that individuality signifies that unique grace that God gives us. Faith is a gift from God. It's unique to each and every one of us. Faith is the work of God, but the people don't understand because they don't have faith. And faith is precisely what Jesus, at this time in salvation history, is trying to arouse in them. Because faith is what will allow them to see beyond the mere physical to reach the spiritual realities that underlie them. Jesus will go farther when they talk about the bread that Moses gave them, the manna, to feed them on their journey. And he points out Moses wasn't the source of the miracle of the manna. He was merely the instrument that helped them to see that God was providing for their daily needs on their journey to the promised land. This daily bread was only a prefiguring of what God was going to do in the fullness of time, to send his only begotten Son to bring life to the world. And notice how Jesus switches from the past tense. It was not Moses who gave you to the present. It is my Father who gives you. The heavenly bread is being given to them now, and Jesus continues to give this heavenly bread today. That's why Jesus says, "For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." And what is that bread, or rather, who is that bread that came down from heaven? Well, Jesus now for the first time will use those two words, "I am." And he'll say that a few more times, and we're familiar with them. "I am the bread of life. I am the vine, you are the branches," and so forth. And Jesus says, "I am," which they recognize are that holy name of God. When they arrest him in the garden during his passion, and Jesus says, "I am." and they all fall to their knees. Interestingly, that's not pointed out anywhere else, but it happens during his passion. But Jesus says, I am the food. I am the food that endures for eternal life. And whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And so in our exodus from death to life, which began with our baptism, the manna to sustain us on our journey to the promised land is the Eucharist. Our promised land is heaven, eternal life with the living God. Read chapter 6 if you've never done so, or if you have, read it again in John's Gospel. The great doctrine which helps us to understand the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And while you ponder that, recall the words of the centurion who asked Jesus to heal his servant. Jesus said, sure, I'll come along. Let's go to your house. And what does he say? Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Only say the word, and I know that my servant will be healed. And Jesus marveled at his faith. And so pray this week that the Lord will strengthen your faith and my faith as we approach the sacred Eucharist each and every week.